what you see happening in the West is that with the rise of individualism and also this kind of stress on inner feelings, being, the authentic person is basically your inner feelings and so forth, you get this stress on the individual, right? The inner life of the individual becomes key also. And then this gets sexualized by like mostly Freud, Sigmund Freud, late 19th and early 20th centuries. He also talks about like the sex drive as being absolutely fundamental, not just to us as like organisms, but kind of central to our identity and what makes us human. And after his time, over the course of the 20th century, sexuality itself, it starts to take on this kind of meaning as this kind of like this autonomous realm of life. Do you know what I'm saying? We don't really have a word in classical Arabic for sexuality. Like that's kind of a new concept. There are words for like, sexual intercourse, marriage, like different kinds of acts there are words for. But the notion that there's a realm of life called sexuality that has this term that's like a separate sphere of consideration, they've come up with like, they try to translate ginsenia or something. They come up with these neologisms, but we don't really have a classical term for that, which means that also the concept didn't really exist as such. But what happens is that sexuality starts to be seen as central to who people are. Do you see what I'm saying? It becomes not just a question of your feelings or your attractions or even your behavior, but it becomes central to who you are as a person. So this is a very important move that takes place. The second thing that happens that I think is also very important is that before the 1960s, right, particularly before the birth control pill, which comes out, I believe, in like 1959, before that time, and we lose sight of this, particularly in the West, before that time, there was no real foolproof method of birth control, okay? So every time a man and a woman had relations with each other, there was always the possibility of the natural result of that behavior, which is pregnancy. Like it is a reproductive act in the end of the day. No matter what other meanings we attach to sexuality personally or culturally or whatever, and there are others, and also as Muslims, yes, it is about love, is it about pleasure, it is about other things too. But in the end of the day, like the act is a potentially reproductive act. And when you don't have like a foolproof method of birth control, it means that every act of sexual intercourse is potentially going to lead to pregnancy, okay? And because the results, the consequences are so grave, no society can really afford to be sexually liberal in the way that post-1960s Western society claims. Because it doesn't make sense. You cannot simply have women getting pregnant randomly with all of these children and having birth, and there's no way to absorb them, and the fathers are not it would be a social disaster. Okay, so that's what you find across history and across religions and ethical systems. There is almost always this notion that sexuality belongs within marriage. Why? Because the consequences are very grave. Okay, what happens is the birth control pill, it does two things. Conceptually, it separates the sex act from its natural consequence by artificially allowing you to engage in the act but not have to face the consequences, because it basically, birth control, it prevents conception from occurring. Okay, so conceptually people say, well, wait a minute, sexuality is, or sexual intercourse is no longer necessarily tied to like pregnancy. Okay, and so it allows the meaning of sex to change. People can start assigning it all these different meanings because you've now separated it from its primarily, like traditionally it was primarily a reproductive thing, and now you've taken the reproduction aspect out of it. So now you can repurpose sexuality to be about relationships, about intimacy, about love, about commitment, about personal identity, about freedom. It can become about all these other things because you've taken that one very consequential element out of it. And secondly, because that aspect is now taken out of it, people, particularly in the West, where the religious, commitments were very weakened, by the time you get to the mid to late 20th century, right, with all of the secularization, people say, well, if pregnancy is now something we can control for, then these old moral rules about keeping sexuality within marriage, we don't need to adhere to these anymore, because the reason we adhere to them is because of pregnancy, and now that's taken out of the picture, so we don't have, we can just get rid of the rules. And so I think this was a major catalyst of the sexual revolution in the 1960s. I think without the pill, you would not really have had that such a movement, because you could not have afforded to, just as a society. It would not have made sense to people. You couldn't do that.